All right, let's jump in and answer some more of your TD questions here. First one says, so I'm not sure if there are any regarding Bethyl, but have you ever picked up on any red herrings in TWD? So far, you've accurately spotted hints and predicted outcomes like Glenn's fake-out death or Jesus' death, and now I'm wondering if there were any times that the writers were purposely leading us in the wrong direction. I can't say I picked up on any of that, but I just didn't watch and analyze TWD as closely as you did. That's why I'm wondering if you noticed any, and in particular, if there was anything related to Bethyl or their stand-ins. I'm not entirely sure I know what you're asking. So if you're asking whether the symbolism has ever turned out to be wrong, no, not that I've ever noticed. Sometimes it's a little unclear and we don't entirely know what it means until it's actually fulfilled. And then there's been times that we have read it wrong or just predicted something wrong. But usually when that was the case, it was based on total guesses on our part, For example, I'll give you some examples of some of these. I didn't think that Glenn would be the one to get killed by Negan, but that wasn't really based on symbolism. I was just hazarding my best guess at who it would be, and because he's the one that gets killed in the comic books, and they usually don't 100% stick to what happens in the comic books, I just assumed that they wouldn't have him be the victim. But they did come out afterward and talk about it, and they just said that they wanted to do that because it was so iconic. And while they usually try to remix everything from the comics so that it is their own thing that's different than the comics, this was the one time that they decided not to do that they really did want to have him give him Glenn's iconic death from the comics. And they asked Stephen Yeun if that was okay, and he was on board with it. And so, but again, that's not based on reading the symbolism. That was really just a guess on my part, and it was kind of an exception to the rule, which, they don't usually do. So let me give you an example of a time that we couldn't figure out what the symbolism meant, and we thought it might be a little bit misleading, and then it wasn't. Back when we watched 712, I think, which is Say Yes. That was the one where Rick and Michonne were looking for supplies and they went into the, defunct carnival, and then Rick fell off the ride and she thought he died for a minute. First of all, tons of symbolism there. He disappears for a minute. She thinks he's dead, and then he pops up a minute later out of a yellow ride car. And, that was just very much feeling like it was a parallel to Beth. But at the time, we did not know that Rick was going to be leaving the show. This was back in season 7, and they didn't really announce that was happening until the hiatus between seasons 8 and 9. So we were still almost a little over a year out from knowing that. So I remember me and my fellow theorists discussing it because we have this thing where they did this little fake out for Rick, this death fake out. And, of course we were going, feels like Beth. It feels like a parallel to her. But then Rick and Michonne have this discussion, this really kind of emotional, intense discussion in the van about how if one of them dies, the other one has to assume leadership, and they just can't fall into their grief because there's too many people counting on them. And we talked about that, and we're going, is it just us, or does it seem like a death foreshadow for one of them? We were going, this is really weird. We don't know what this is pointing to. We really can't see them killing off Rick or Michonne. So, and we were a little bit stumped by it. The following season, in the mid-season finale, we lost Carl. And I remember W.D. Way saying to me, do you think that could be the fulfillment of what they were talking about in 712? Because they were talking about themselves, like the two of them. They didn't mention their children. But still, Carl was a big deal. He was a big loss for them. And maybe it was just pointing to, if we have a big loss, we have to keep going or something like that. And I thought that could be the case, but it was still a little weird to me that they, you would think if they were going to do that, he would have added if one of us die or if we lose one of the kids or something like that, but he didn't say anything about that. So it kind of felt we were going, well, maybe it was pointing to Carl's death, but if that was the case, it was a little bit misdirected because they seem to be talking about each other, not about their children. But then, so if that's what you're asking, I mean, there are times when it might seem like it's a little bit misdirected because we can't figure out what it's pointing to yet. But then when we learned that Rick was leaving, well, clearly 712, in hindsight, we can look at it and say that was obviously a foreshadow of Rick's death fake out and Michonne believing he was alive and then eventually she's going to realize that he is, and she's going to go find him, and they're going to have a reunion. So then the symbolism in 712 made sense, but not until we understood what he was leaving and what it was actually pointing to. So I'm just going to say no. I've never picked up on anything that was intentionally misleading. At least not inside the show. Outside the show, you know, when it comes to promos and them talking and doing interviews, they can be a little bit, they can give us misdirections, but that's not quite the same thing. That's not a red herring in the symbolism or in the show. So I hope that answers your question. If it doesn't, feel free to write back in again and clarify. But that's exactly why I trust the symbolism. Every time I've predicted something, you know, I've said, okay, but based on the symbolism, I think this is what's going to happen. Okay, so I've said this a lot of times before. It's not about me being smart. It's not about me guessing correctly and getting lucky. Okay, it's about reading the symbolism. So with Glenn, for example, and I know I've told this story many times, he had a lot of Beth's dialogue. He had all the same symbolism around him back in season 6 when they did his death fake out, right? And I actually said that, okay, well, based on the symbolism, based on the precedent and the pattern they have set in the show, he should be alive. And if he's not, then we, TDers, are screwed, because that means Beth isn't either, because it's all the same symbolism. But he was alive, okay? And every single time that's happened, every time we've seen similar symbolism around another character that we saw around Beth, and it seems like they're dead, they're actually alive. We saw the exact same symbolism around Rick right before he left in season 9, okay? And we know he's alive. We saw a lot of the same stuff around Heath when he disappeared, and Angela Kane confirmed he's alive, okay? So yeah, I think that Gimple tries really hard to stick to that so that, you know, I mean, it's subtle. People might say, well, yeah, but then we could predict what's happening. Yeah, but how many people actually do? We're a very small corner of the fandom who pay attention to this. Most of the GA doesn't, so most people don't notice at all, you know. So he keeps to that for the sake of precedent and probably to keep himself telling the right story and staying on the rails, you know. So anyway, hope that answers your question. Okay, next one. Not a question, just wanted to thank you for adding to my daily ritual of binge watching whatever I like on YouTube. For the last week and a half, your newest upload is the first thing I watch. Oh, thank you. And it really sets the tone for a good evening. Thank you for your work. Oh, you're welcome. It is my pleasure to do it. I really love doing it. I love geeking out about this stuff. You guys are feeding my addiction a little bit by sending in questions. So, but I really, really appreciate that. Thank you. And I'm glad that you like the videos. Not Beth related or TD related, but I've always wondered what was the point of Rick and Jessie's brief relationship in seasons 5B and 6A of the flagship show. Can you explain this? If the powers that be were hinting for were shown from earlier seasons, why have Rick and Jessie become a thing for a short time? Whew, okay. This is a bit of a doozy. There are two main reasons, I think, for Jessie. The first actually is a Beth thing. The second is a relationship thing. So let's talk about the Beth thing. We did see some Beth parallels to Jessie. They were not super deep, I will say. She was blonde, for one thing. She fought the wolves, and the wolf symbolism is important. We had this scene where there was another female wolf who came into Jessie's house and was threatening her and her son Sam, and so Jessie killed her with scissors. Remember the scissors around Beth? In the kitchen. And so we saw a lot of Beth symbolism there, and we just saw her as, even though Jessie was, I don't know that she was anyone's favorite character. She was kind of toxic. She didn't have the very best parenting skills. Even the actress that played her admitted that her parenting skills were not good. But she was also someone who started out very weak and did get stronger, even though they killed her off pretty quickly. We did see her become stronger. So in a very surface way, it was kind of like Beth, but that's all. The reason that I say that she could be a Beth thing, though, more than just those surface similarities, is that I really do believe something to do with the missing 17 days, something to do with Rick's guilt over what happened in Coda played very much into his relationship with Jessie. Now, please understand, this is difficult to explain without making it sound like I think Rick is in love with Beth or something, and I do not believe that at all. But, you know, even if it was, so his relationship to Beth was very much father-daughter, and I think especially because of Herschel, he felt kind of a duty to watch over Herschel's children after Herschel died because he was not able to save Herschel. And we kind of see that at Grady when he kisses Beth on the forehead. I mean, it's very much like a father-daughter interaction, but then he was not able to save her either. And remember that it was his plan, or no, it wasn't his plan. He wanted to go in guns blazing, but he killed evil Officer Bob. And if they had had a third person to trade, then Dawn would not have had grounds for demanding that Noah stay. You know, they would have traded 3 for 2, and then it wouldn't have been a question of Noah going back, and then, you know, Beth probably wouldn't have gotten shot, or at least that is how Rick might see it, and he might have a lot of guilt over that. So here's how I kind of came to this, and me and my fellow theorists have discussed it a lot. First of all, you have to remember that when Rick got together with Jessie, she was very much a damsel in distress, okay? She was in an abusive relationship. She was not happy. She was very upset, and she was begging for help. And Rick does go around saving people. He does have a little bit of a savior complex, and I really don't mean that in a bad way. I mean, that's just who he is. If someone's in distress, he wants to help them because he's genuinely a good guy, and he goes around saving people and protecting people. So he wanted very much to help her and to protect her, and she was reaching out to him. And that's actually part of why the relationship was not the healthiest, because it wasn't based on two people who were in a healthy relationship, who were in a healthy place and were in the same, like on the same emotional ground. It was very much based on the fact that he wanted to save her and she was in distress. And so that was probably not going to be a long-term relationship that could be sustained anyway, because it was not built from a very healthy place. But think about that for a minute. He did something that led to Beth getting shot. We've talked about before how Coda is very much being seen, not from Daryl's perspective, not from Beth's perspective, mostly from Rick's perspective. Okay, so whatever went down there, we're seeing it through his eyes in a lot of ways. And he probably had a lot of guilt over the fact that he couldn't save her, that this young blonde girl that he wanted to protect got killed. And if they then couldn't, you know, everything that we talk about happening over the missing 17 days, they couldn't find her, they couldn't put her down, they couldn't lay her to rest, all of that. I do think that Rick had some PTSD over that, where Beth was concerned. And again, not because it's a romantic thing, but because of just what happened and how he felt about her. And I think it's important that in 9:05, right before he left, when he was having his hallucinations, he saw Herschel, because it really does come back to Herschel and how close he was to Herschel. Herschel was his mentor. And so, like I said, he felt a duty to protect Herschel's kids, and he failed in that where Beth was concerned. So there's a lot of psychological things that play into it. And there's a part in season 5B where Rick is watching Jessie and her husband walk, you know, just across Alexandria, and they're playing that song from the Bee Gees about, it's called, Spicks and Specks, I think. You can look it up, and it talks about where is the girl I left behind. And that's really telling to me that they used that song. In the moment, Rick seems really creepy because he's looking murderously at Jessie's husband, and he comes across as a creeper, you know. But I think they used that song in order to show that a lot of what was going on with him and Jessie has to do with the blonde girl he left behind and his guilt over that. So even though him and Jessie were a romantic relationship, and I think that's just the way it manifested, especially because she was interested in him and she was trying to get away from her husband, who should have been her romantic relationship, but it had turned really, really abusive. But I think a lot of that was just dealing with Rick's state of mind after everything that happened in 5A, because they were all a mess after what happened in 5A. Lots of stuff that was just super, super messed up. I don't need to preach to you guys about that. And so I think it had a lot to do with that. And it does have a lot to do with Beth, but not in a way that's super obvious. It's very, very, very subtle. And they kind of hid the reasons for it from us in the same way they hid why Daryl was so pissed at Rick during that first time. It's because of stuff that happened during the missing 17 days. So I think once we get those missing 17 days and then we go back and watch 5B, it's going to make a lot more sense, and we're going to have all kinds of light bulb moments like, oh, that's why that was going on. You know what I mean? But right now, we can only try to interpret what they're giving us. Okay, so that's the first reason. Then I said the other reason was a relationship reason. So there is a pattern in The Walking Dead where most people have a non-soulmate relationship before they find their soulmate. So, you know, Beth had several boyfriends in the early seasons. For Daryl, it was Leah. I think a big part of the reason for Leah was, as Gimple said, it was growing up, it was having a relationship, but it's also having one that doesn't end up being your soulmate or your, lifelong partner relationship, specifically because you just learn that, maybe that's not what you want. And so we had seen Michonne had a boyfriend, before the apocalypse, and specifically, he was not her equal because he let her down. He let her son die, and that was a big part of what happened to her before. And of course, Rick did have Lori, so it wasn't like he had not had a relationship before, but I think they wanted him to have another one that was specifically kind of toxic. And then if you notice, they killed off Jessie in 609, and 610 was when he got together with Michonne. So even though I think there was a time jump there of a month or 3 months, something like that, it was the next episode, and that's very telling. As soon as he was done with Jessie, very quickly, him and Michonne, got together. We've seen this in other relationships. Carol was with Tobin right before she got together with Ezekiel. Sasha had Bob before she found Abraham. And Bob wasn't particularly toxic. He was kind of the opposite of toxic. But the point is, it was a short-term relationship. And I really think that Abraham was supposed to be her soulmate. And that's why, they did everything the way they did when both she and Abraham died. So anyway, that's the other reason that I think they had it. They just wanted Rick to also have a short-term relationship that was clearly not, his soulmate, his end-all be-all, and it was kind of works as a contrast to Michonne, so that when he gets together with Michonne, we can see the difference. How much happier he is, how much more healthier relationship it is, that they're on equal footing, all of that. So, I hope that explains it for you. Like I said, it's kind of a doozy. There's a lot that goes into it that has to do with season 5 and what was going on in season 5. And of course, everything with that revolves around Beth. So, all right, I'm going to stop there for today, but I will be back with more tomorrow. See you guys then.